Good morning. I'm glad to be here with you again. We're going to talk today about one of the most beloved figures in American history, and that is Dolly Madison. I hope that by the end of this lecture that you will see her as much more than just the most successful hostess in Washington society, but that you will see her as an American patriot who loved her nation, who loved the American people, who loved the Lord in her own unique way, and who loved her husband with all of her heart. And I think there's every reason in the world to put her, if not at the very top, certainly right near the top of our first ladies. And every time I teach this class, every time I read about Dolly, I love her even more. And I hope that you feel the same way. We have some hidden gems in our look at our survey of our look at the first ladies in America. We have some who are a little more obscure, who a little more mystery about them, who are wonderful and just need to be examined to see their luster. But Dolly's right out there in the forefront, and she would probably not understand that, but she would like it. And I think you will see why she is so popular in all areas of American society and through the eyes of all American historians. All right, let's start off a little bit with her early life, and then we'll move very quickly towards her path of meeting the great little Madison, as she called him. Dolly was born in a Quaker settlement in North Carolina named New Garden, and she was born on May 20th, 1768. Her family will relocate to Virginia and then ultimately to Philadelphia. Now, Dolly's family was quite a large family. I think at one time there were 11 children, certainly not all of whom lived to adulthood. And I believe that Dolly was the oldest daughter, and she had quite a bit of responsibility in helping her mother take care of the younger children, and that wasn't unusual. Dolly's family life was not the easiest in the world. Her father was a very good man. He was not raised a Quaker as her mother was, and he wanted to be accepted. He will convert, and he will embark upon a business venture and move to Philadelphia in pursuit of that. Basically, I believe as a shop owner, and he didn't do very well. And unfortunately, within the Quaker faith tradition at that time, if you did not do well at business, it was seen, or in your profession, it was seen as a spiritual problem. And I actually think that he was disfellowshipped from the Society of Friends. That would I would want to double check on, but I think that he was disfellowshipped and had to work his way back in and work his way back into the community. Now, unfortunately, he will die, and this is tragic for any family. But imagine being responsible for that many children. Dolly's mother, Mary, will turn their home in Philadelphia into a boarding house, and this was completely respectable, and it was not uncommon. And you can better believe that in such a city of such hustle and bustle as Philadelphia, that a boarding house stood to make some profit, at least enough to take care of your family. And perhaps that's where Dolly learned some of her hostess duties, or learned to take care of people's needs and to anticipate them. Dolly herself will marry in 1790 to John Todd, and by all accounts, they had a happy marriage. They will have two sons, John Todd, John Payne Todd, and William Temple Todd. Tragedy strikes, however, and in a marshy, wet, humid city like Philadelphia, with questionable sanitation technology, diseases like typhoid and yellow fever race through the city in epidemic proportions. And sadly, uh, Dolly will become sick with this. Typhoid fever, I believe, is what it would have been referred to then. Typhoid fever. She will get it, her husband will get it and perish, and their youngest son, William, will also become ill and die. And Dolly, bless her, will be widowed after only 3 years of marriage. And unlike Martha Washington, she did not have a great amount of wealth behind her to make her that much more eligible. She will travel back to Virginia, where she'll stay some time with her sister, but she will actually be introduced to her husband to be by one of the lodgers at her mother's boarding house, none other than one of the great villains of the American political landscape, Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was a friend to Dolly, as was everyone. Some speculation has bubbled up as maybe there was a romance. I don't know that there is any historical currency to that. I think they were just friends, but he will be responsible really for introducing the two. And when her name is presented to Madison, like the great scholar that he was, he did his homework on her, trying to find out all he could about her and her family, and anticipated meeting her, I think, with great excitement. And they are a perfect match. And she will actually marry James Madison less than a year after she was widowed, and that was kind of unusual too. They will marry in 1794 and will remain married quite successfully until his death in 1836. Let me talk a little bit about them and about their unique look as a couple. Dolly was at least 3 inches taller than Madison. He was very diminutive. I think maybe about 5'4", and she was taller. And her personality would be uh, perceived as absolutely the opposite of Madison's. And she always called him Madison. Others called him Jimmy, but she called him Madison. And she was vivacious and outgoing, never met a stranger, and he was considered sometimes just too bookish, just someone who wanted to be back left alone with his books and his thoughts. But they together made a wonderful couple, I think, complementing each other in every way. And he never wanted to be separated from her. He would grow morose and taciturn whenever she was not around, when she was out or visiting her family, or doing some of work in wherever she was living for someone else. In terms of in Let me just jump ahead a little bit. As you all remember, Jefferson's wife had died, so he depended on his daughter, but also Dolly was able to help him. But if she was away working with Jefferson, and helping him with hostess duties, you know Madison was just grumpy because she was not around. So by every account, they had a marvelous marriage, and one that they completed each other, and it's a wonderful love story. And if I would strongly suggest Dolly as one of your biographies if you're doing that option with your research. One thing that I want to let you know is when Dolly married Madison, it was in an Episcopalian ceremony. And although she always retained her Quaker values by her own account, she was sadly disfellowshipped from the church because Madison did not convert, and their marriage was one that was not done as a Quaker ceremony. It was done as an Episcopalian, and that hurt her deeply. However, I want to say this. Dolly loved color, and she loved beautiful clothing. And as a Quaker, they shied away from bright colors in terms of their personal apparel. And they, in fact, wore I don't want to say drab because that has such negative connotations, but grays and browns and blacks. And to her, I think she felt free, she felt released. And her favorite color was yellow, and she wore it anytime she had a chance. Once she makes it to Washington, she becomes a, uh, gosh, what's the best word to use today? She was someone who set fashion traditions, and everybody wanted to see what she was wearing. She wasn't a snob about it like some other first ladies that we'll see a little bit. And that's an unkind word, but she just dressed. She she was released. She wanted to just be beautifully dressed, colorfully dressed. She loved the Empire waistline. I can talk about this a little bit here. She loved the Empire waistline, where the waistline is just below the bosom, and then the dress flows freely from there. She loved those. She loved turbans, and she really set the trend in Washington for wearing turbans and feathers in her hair and flowers in her hair. And I think, here's just an interpretation. I think that if she wore um, sheets or togas, or sheets around her waist tied with a ribbon, or togas with a sash over her shoulder, or sackcloth, as it were, I think she would have been the trendsetter because she was so beloved. She was so appreciated, and that she set style just because of the force of her personality. But she did like clothes, and especially turbans, from Paris. So she was, in these early years, someone who really did try to bring as much of the current fashion from Europe over here. But I do believe that she was followed and adored because of her personality, and she set a trend that way. So, a little bit about her role in Washington. James Madison was the Secretary of State for Jefferson, and as a single man, Jefferson always needed, by protocol, by the habit, there needed to be a woman if he was going, in place as official hostess at any formal events. I think even if they were just with men attending, it was ideal for there still to be a woman. His beloved daughter, Patsy, or Martha, as you know, is her given name. Patsy did as much as that she possibly could, but there was still more to be done. And Dolly was accepted by Jefferson, which wasn't an easy thing to happen. Dolly was accepted by Jefferson, and I believe that she smoothed out some of the wrinkles that could occur in formal entertaining for the president, and made his life much easier for him. And that was good experience for her. And her gift, if to use our parlance here, her spiritual gift was not only hospitality, but it was bringing political enemies into the same room in a way that they could forget about being political enemies. Everyone was a guest, everyone was welcome, everyone was part of her extended family, and it did not matter what your political leanings were. And this was a time, class, when our nation was growing terribly divided by political differences. We are on the verge right now of our second war for independence from Great Britain, and it was very divided between the Federalists, who did not want a war with England, and the Jeffersonians, who saw this as a way to settle the issue once and for all. The War Hawks, as they were called. And Dolly managed to keep everybody from declaring war on each other during this time. I think a wonderful class to teach, and I hope that I get the opportunity to do this one day, is one based on the early Federalist era and beyond, where we go from about 1800, well, let's say 1796 to perhaps the age of Jackson and the ascendancy of Andrew Jackson to the White House in 1828. And you see in the early part of that time a terrible rise in partisan politics. Much like we have today, we think that today all of this partisanship is just part of our era, and that's not true. It's always been there. So there will be a brief time when the nation was a one-party nation, and is known as the era of good feelings in the Monroe administration, just following the War of 1812. But that certainly does not last, and partisan politics comes screaming back onto the political scene in 1824 and 1828 in those elections, very difficult presidential elections. But Dolly transcended political differences. She transcended partisan differences, and she brought everyone together. And I just can't tell you enough about how valuable that was we were still a fragile young nation. I think one of another exciting event in American history that's part of this era that seems to not get the attention it deserves is the War of 1812. When I teach the history of the American Revolution, I always tell my students that when the treaty was signed, and or even back up before that, when the English leave and after Yorktown, and then the peace treaty was signed, I believe it was really in the mind of England that this was a temporary, that this was a truce, more of an armistice, and yeah, we'll recognize you as an independent nation, but we'll be back. You won't be able to stand on your own as a nation, and you'll come to your senses, and we'll come and finish the job and restore you to the empire. Of course, we know that that was not a successful endeavor on the part of the British, but it looked very bad for a time. And let's flip over here and let's place Dolly in the position as First Lady now. When James Madison was elected to the presidency following the two terms of Jefferson, he's elected in 1808. Things were very difficult. Relationship with England and France were difficult. And really it comes down to class, and I know you remember this from American One, is which one were we going to go to war with? Is it going to be England or France? Well, England made it easy for us, and the War of 1812 will begin with Madison's second term. And I believe we came perilously close to being conquered by the English. You all know this is the era that gave us our beautiful Star Spangled Banner, and but things were very bleak for a time. And this is perhaps Dolly's most famous moments. When in 1814 the British actually land on the coast of this nation, they will begin an all-out march towards the capital. And in fact, when they come to Washington, they will destroy all of our buildings there except the patent office when I talk about our governmental buildings. As they are coming, or as they are marching through, uh, Dolly is actually in the executive mansion. I know it's referred to as the White House, but this is the president's house. The British called it the Yankee Palace. She will be there, and Madison has gone out actually to see where the fighting is going on. She's terribly worried about him. She doesn't want to leave without him, but she knows that, to use an old term, the British are coming. And she stays as long as she possibly can. She's being urged by everyone to leave because she would have been quite a prize for the British to capture and would have been a focal point for negotiation and perhaps even surrender. So, when she decides that she finally has to go, she'll tell you, she says, I'm a Quaker, but if I wish there were a cannon in every window of this building and I would not leave. But she realizes that she has to go. She will have ordered down the Gilbert Stuart painting of whom she calls General Washington. To her, to Dolly, Washington was truly the father of our nation, and this painting belonged to the American people. She saw the house in which she lived as belonging to the American people. And that kind of patriotism makes my heart soar. It's just amazing. It's amazing at this early stage, what a heartfelt influence she had on shaping how we look at our nation, how we look at these buildings, at the Capitol, at this artwork. Dolly sometimes is credited with taking down the painting itself, but she doesn't. She has to order it taken down as encased in a very heavy frame, and some of her personal slaves will extricate it. They break the glass on the frame and carefully take it out, and they are heroes in and of themselves. And I think that would be a great paper topic one day if anybody's ever looking for anything, is all that was involved in the painting of that great portrait and then the rescue of it when danger was at the front door. Now, what's not discussed as often is what else Dolly managed to save. And I would like to know more details myself about which documents were actually involved. As you know, James Madison is considered the father of the American Constitution. And by that, I want you to understand is that he helped organize the Constitutional Convention. He brought to the convention many ideas. He sort of oversees the keeping of official records of the convention. This was a very secretive event. The press was not allowed. There were armed sentries at the door, and he kept the records. I believe that some of the documents that she rescued and took with her when she left included perhaps his journals regarding the Constitutional Convention. Now, you can go to your library now and read those. They're no longer secret documents. You can go read them, you can check them out. But at this point, they were still sort of kept under wraps, and she saved history. Now, this is going to come out later to help her, and in a way, I'll tell you. But she saved history. In history, we have people that we'll see who I call history killers, who do their best to destroy the historical record, to destroy tradition. And unfortunately, I believe that we're living in a time when that is taking place. But Dolly was not a history killer. She was a history savior. She kept it for us and for us to enjoy. And the beloved painting of Gilbert Stuart by Gilbert Stuart of Washington was certainly something that did belong to the American people and that we have now because of Dolly's foresight in saving it. Well, you know the rest of the story. Things were going very badly there until the Battle of Bladensburg and the battle uh, where they were sometimes called the Bladensburg races. Um, Things didn't turn around until the engagement at Fort McHenry. And we have our beautiful, beautiful national anthem that comes out of what Francis Scott Key watched take place. I still get teary-eyed when I think about that story, when I think about the what he saw and witnessed and how it inspired him to write this great anthem. It's a wonderful part of our nation's heritage. And Dolly was in the midst of all that, and her husband, James Madison, was in the midst of all that. And because of their character and bravery, they held the nation together. And you had Andrew Jackson fighting in the South. You had our privateers, our little private militia boats fighting. It was amazing. And providentially, we were able to continue as a nation. And I'm pleased to say that really from that point forward, our success in this battle, England became perhaps our strongest ally in history and no longer an enemy, but a friend. And that's the way things should be. Now, after all of this the fighting was over, unfortunately, Washington was destroyed. The city, as I told you, other than in terms of the official buildings, other than the patent house, the patent office, all of the official buildings were destroyed, and the Yankee Palace was no longer habitable. Unfortunately, Dolly well, I shouldn't say unfortunately, while she occupied the position of First Lady. That title was not yet to come. But while as First Lady, she secured monies from Congress to do some work on the executive mansion to make it a little bit better than it had been. Jefferson happened to be such a well-renowned architect. He hadn't had a lot done. But it was moving towards a building of which we really could have been proud. Unfortunately, that building is gone. Dolly and James will live in the Octagon House, a private residence that is still exists. I think it's still there today. I'm not sure if you can tour it. They will live there for a few months and then they will move into a townhouse that was really located on the city sidewalk. As you know, when you think about a sidewalk, a roadway, uh, people could walk right by and look in. And she actually seemed to enjoy that. When the army walked through, there were troops that walked through. They went by and waved and saluted, and they were so glad. They looked at her as someone who had fought alongside them to save the nation and save her independence. And she had a little parrot that she would keep in the cage in a window, and she encouraging people to stop by. She never met a stranger, and she made herself as accessible as possible. So there's more to be said, I know, about her entertaining, and I encourage you to see what you can find about it. She would have people from all walks of life come to her get-togethers, and she was very friendly. She did all the hard work for Madison in terms of organization and the socializing, which was very difficult for him as well. You might can write the founding document of the nation, but shaking hands with everybody at a party is a little tough. It was hard for Washington too, but with Madison it really was difficult. But she made everything move as smoothly as possible and added to his prestige and the concept of him as a successful president. She was there. After they left office, he completed 2 terms. Madison went to his home, Montpelier, in Virginia, and she fulfilled, I think this is probably one of my favorite stories. He wanted to write down more of his recollections about all of his political work. And he was 17 years older than her. He was arthritic and he had some health issues. But she stood with him, and she actually became what I would call a scribe, more than, a secretary, someone who wrote down and kept track of the documents. And again, fulfilling that beautiful role as helpmeet here in this capacity, one that was not as public or obvious as being a hostess in Washington, D.C. But in the quiet hours of their family life, in the quiet time of their family life, she still did all these things to help him fulfill whatever mission it was he needed to complete. Sadly, he will. Oh, before I forget, I really want to tell you this, and this is another area. I apologize for having to backtrack. During her time in Washington, she would go in and encourage other ladies to watch debates in the Capitol building, and she was even allowed in some of the Supreme Court hearings. And she wasn't there to make a spectacle of herself or to cause problems, but just to be interested in the workings of our nation. And I think that's marvelous. And she would encourage other women to go. And she's not a feminist. She's not someone trying to carve out, I'm going to be in this meeting and I'm going to have my say. She was there to sit quietly and I would say decorously as well, certainly cheering everyone there with her feathers in her turban. But she was there just because she wanted to show interest in our young nation. And isn't that a lovely thought that you you serve your husband, you love your nation, you're a patriot at a time when you are setting a trend that's more important than an empire waistline. You are setting a trend for women to love their husbands and to love their nation. So I can't emphasize that enough, and that's something that you might delve into a little bit more. But if I go back on where I was on the timeline, I'm sorry, I am just going really long with this today. But I do want you to know that in the years after the death of her beloved Madison, Dolly will struggle in poverty. And it wasn't because of a profligate or spendthrifty lifestyle on her part. It was unfortunately because of her own son. Her son, whom she and Madison had spoiled, uh, was not a good person. He had, I think, an absence of morals. And it wasn't that just that he was a spendthrift. He had all kind of other issues. And he takes every penny she has. There were friends who helped sort of support her, and Congress will vote her special monies and will buy from her the documents, and she would have given them. But this was a way that the government could take care of her. They will allow her to have some dignity in the situation. They will buy from her some of Madison's great documents. She will eventually lose the home uh, that was her husband's, Montpelier. And there's other stories that are out there about her son trying to get these monies away from her, trying to have her declared mentally incompetent, and none of it was true. It's just terrible. I mean, in terms of about her, it was just terrible. She will be buried in Washington, but eventually the home will be restored, and she will be buried with Madison there, I believe, in Montpelier. So Dolly did not have the easiest of lives. Let's look at that and recap for just a second. She lost her beloved father. She watched him before his death fail in business. Uh, they struggled financially. She loses her first husband. She loses a child. She marries and meets the needs of this wonderful president, and I think bringing him to a level of success he might not have had otherwise. And she smoothed political waters during some of the most turbulent times in our nation's history in terms of our internal fussing and fighting. She smoothed those rough waters. She brought him to the other side, in on the other side of the war, and stood with him, stood gallantly, uh, faithfully, with great patriotism and love for her nation and love for the American people. That's another thing. She loved the American people. And she believed that we had established a marvelous nation with a heritage that had to be preserved and defended. And she'll do that. She stood by her husband till his death of congestive heart failure and did her best to promote him throughout the rest of her life. She's much beloved by everybody, from Henry Clay to Andrew Jackson, from Jefferson, who liked not just about anybody, and they all loved Dolly. It's hard to find an unkind word that's said about her. So she went through all of these difficulties: the war, the death of her second husband, the poverty, the difficulty and betrayal by her own son, and yet she was always cheerful. And there's a word that is used in a different context today, but there's a word. I grew up, if you said someone was gay, it was like they had an effervescence, they had a happiness within them, and that describes her, that effervescence, that gayness, that happiness, always looking on the bright yellow side of things. So there is plenty of justification for putting her at the top of the list, as we said at the outset of this. And I encourage you to look at her life even more closely. Now, the next time that we're together, we're going to talk about Elizabeth Monroe. Now, Elizabeth is a little bit different. She has quite an exciting background that we'll talk about. But her life as First Lady was not easy either, and we'll see why. We'll go from Elizabeth Monroe to the beautiful and wonderful musical Louisa Adams. And she's another one that perhaps didn't have the easiest of times. But we'll have a lot of fun talking about these two First Ladies. And then we'll move on to Rachel Jackson, who never served as First Lady, but we want to talk about the influence that she nevertheless had on her husband and her husband's administration. So thank you for your attention, and I look very much forward to continuing our discussion soon. Thank you, as always, for your patience, and I encourage you, please, if you have any questions about this material, to email me. I love to talk about this. If there's any sources that I can help you find, please let me know. And I hope that you